Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi, Trumois, Perek Aleph, Halacha Aleph. We're learning today Daf Ches, starting from the brackets, 7 lines from the top of the Amid. We're dedicating today's class for Chaim Ben Nisan. That's Kavan's brother's yard site. That was this past Shabbos. May Yisrael Shabbat have an Aliyah. Amen. And we are now going back to the final part of the Mishnah of Halacha Aleph, and just quoting the words of the Mishnah. The Mishnah now speaks specifically about the minor, that cotton, shaloi hevi shtei sa'aros, Rabbi Yehuda oimer, that b'di'evet truma se truma. Rabbi Yosi oimer, im ad shaloi balo oinas nedarim, ein truma se truma, umisha balo oinas nedarim, yes truma se truma. So what becomes evident from this machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosi is that, first of all, let's quickly review that there is a halacha about nedarim, and we will see that what is correct about nedarim is correct about consecrating an animal to become a korban, that even though normally a minor cannot affect a halachic change until he is an adult, nevertheless, vows are different. That Hashem gave the koyach to a minor, as we'll see more details in today's daf, whether this is according to all opinions or not, that if he's in the age that's called mufla hasamach leish, which means a boy 12 and a girl 11, or exact specific 12 in one day and 11 in one day, then they are able to effect a vow. And therefore, let's go to Shitas Rabbi Yosi, just like a katan hamufla, a mufla leish, is able to affect a vow, he also can separate truma, because we're making a comparison initially between truma and a neder. How are they the same? That just like a neder, one is empowered through one's words to elevate the status of something that was permitted becomes prohibited. You're adding a certain amount of prohibition and to some degree sanctity. Similarly, truma, that's exactly what you're doing. Through your words, you're imbuing in something the kedusha of truma. Now, therefore, says Rabbi Yosi, that truma is like a neder. This clarifies what Rabbi Yehuda holds. When Rabbi Yehuda argues with Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehuda is saying a big chiddush, that even though by a neder Rabbi Yehuda agrees, only the mufla hasamach leish is able to make a neder. When someone is not even 12, a boy is not even 12, a girl is not even 11, they are unable to make a neder. Nevertheless, Rabbi Yehuda holds truma is something that if a minor, even though he's not even a mufla, obviously if he understands the meaning of truma, that a minor with enough intelligence to know what is truma is able to separate truma. Now, that's a big thing. Now, what logic will we have behind that? Why would truma be even easier to be affected? So there's a Tosfos in Nida that says Gavaldik. And this is really touching in our words of introduction, two ways of understanding tevel. The word tevel is the name of produce prior to it being fixed, misukan, fixed by having all of the tithes separated from it. One way of looking at tevel is that when something grows prior to separating the trumas and maasros, it's called tevel, and it's prohibited. And then when you go ahead and you separate the truma and you separate the maaser, you fix the tevel. Or tevel is a mixture of trumas and maasros and ordinary food, as if truma is already there, but it's mixed together. Why are you not allowed to eat tevel? Because in it is truma. How can you eat tevel? It's like meduma. If we were to understand tevel as the latter, that it's already a mixture of, not a new category of tevel, then what the minor is doing is very inconsequential. He's not affecting a new sanctity. He's simply revealing what part is truma and what part is not truma. He's separating. It's almost like the concept of Bereira. And therefore, that's Tosfos' logic, Beshitas Rabbi Yehuda, that even a minor that's not a mufla is able to separate truma. Now, that's what we learned in the Mishnah. Now, what's going to become clear today is something Gavaldik. What does the Tanakama hold? The Tanakama writes, right, the 5 categories of people that not only cannot lachatchila separate truma, but even if they did it b'di'evet, it's not effective. One of the 5 is a minor. The Tanakama make no differentiation between a mufla or not a mufla. And enachanami, in other words, really we have in the Mishnah 3 opinions. And the Tanakama, as the Gemara will begin today to show you that this is the sheet of Rabbi Meir, holds that a minor until he is 13 years old, and more than that, really 13 years old, and his body is beginning to mature, he is unable to separate truma. Now the question will be, what will be the sheet of Rav Meir when it comes to Nedarim? Is it that Rav Meir says that a minor until bar mitzvah cannot affect anything? Or is there something unique about Truma? And actually, we're going to see a logic. One of the opinions, Bishitas Rav Meir, today in the Gemara will be, is that Rav Meir agrees that a minor, we're not going to begin with that. We're going to come to that later in today's daf, that a minor could make a neder when he's a mufla. But Truma, he can only separate when he's a bona fide adult. Now, I'm going to give you an opposite logic. Why is that? Before we explained why Truma is the easiest to do. Now we're going to give you another logic that we'll have today, why Truma is the hardest to do. And that is that making something prohibited is a lot easier than making something permitted. You have a shaila, right? You don't know what the halacha is. The one who's less knowledgeable can say usher. It takes a greatness to say permitted. Not chas v'shalom permitted because one is lax, one doesn't care, because you really know. In other words, a minor is able to take something that's permitted and to make a vow and to say now it's prohibited. We'll see, he might be able to consecrate an animal. When you designate truma, it's not only that you're taking something and you're making it holy, only permitted for a kohen. That's part of the truma, but there's another part of that, and that is that everything else is no longer tevel. You're taking away a status of Isur and you're bringing in a status of Heter. That's something for which you have to be an adult. Anyways, we're going to have all of these svaras today. We'll just leave it at that. The whole daf today will be about the different understandings about a minor, and the big topics will be Nedarim, Karbanos, and our topic of Truma. Whether they all travel together, whether they don't fully travel together. And again, we have the 3 opinions, Tanakam of our Mishnah, which will be Rav Meir. And explicitly, what you see in our Mishnah in the Seifa, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, again, what the Mishnah writes explicitly that we already learned when we learned Daf Aleph, Rabbi Yehuda holds that if a minor is intelligent enough, even if he's not a mufla, it's amazing, he's able to separate Truma. Rabbi Yossi says no. Rabbi Yossi says Truma is like Nedarim. He has to be a mufla. And whenever we say a man, we mean a minor boy, mufla 12, a minor girl, mufla 11. Okay, Chavra, let's hit it right inside. Daf Ches Amud Aleph, by the brackets, you see that cotton, 7 lines from the top. Cotton, actually, hevish teisa arais. The premise of the Gemara is that since in the Seif of the Mishnah you have a machlekes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, Masha'en Kain, the Tanakama opened up the Mishnah, Chamisha lo yitroimu, and not only that, V'im tarmu ein trumas and truma. And from the 5 you have the cotton, is a raya, already a given, that the Tanakama holds that even if you are a mufla, the Tanakama is, let's say, more machmir, or more makel, depends how you want to word it, than Rabbi Yossi. Even a mufla cannot affect truma. Who is that? Who is that author? So the Gemara says that Tani b'shem Rabbi Meir. I have a brisa, and there we see clearly who has that opinion, and that's Rabbi Meir. That these are the words of Rav Meir. Lo'olam ein trumasei truma at sheyavish teisa arais. Very good. Even if the minor reaches the age of mufla, hasamach leish, and he's intelligent, nevertheless, he is unable to separate truma. Very simple. And that's a sheet of the Tanakh. Shitas Rav Meir. Now, what was that? You are near the age and you are articulating from hafla'a, from speaking. Aleph, Pele. Okay, now I just want everyone to know that there are two girsois in our Gemara. There are going to be two topics, two clauses on Daf Ches Amud Aleph. Every version has both. It's simply a question of the Seder of which one comes first, which one comes second. And the Ois V'Hadar determined how they did that. These are great Talmidei Chachamim. They followed the majority. And we're going to be following the Seder in the Gemara the way the Ois V'Hadar has it. If in your Gemara you have it in the opposite version, whatever you think I'm skipping now, we'll put in still on Amud Aleph. So let's go. Says the Gemara. Rabbi Yudah b'shem Rab Hila. And what are we beginning with? We're beginning with what is the source of Rabbi Meir, which is, by the way, quite ironic. I'm saying it's quite ironic because if you remember, on Daf Aleph, we learned that from the word ish, remember the Gemara began over there quoting the Pasha, the beginning of Parshas Truma. And the Torah uses the words me'es kol ish asher yidvenu liboy, if you remember. So the yidvenu liboy we said means kavana, that excluded the shoita and the chedesh. And we already spoke out then. Yidvenu liboy could exclude also the minor. He's also not fully developed. Nevertheless, there is an ish. For whatever reason, our Amoyroim, there's going to be a total of 3 sources for Rav Meir now. We are not using ish that we find in Truma. In the beginning of Parshas Truma, we're looking for other sources that exclude the minor. And furthermore, we want to exclude the minor, not the way Rabbi Yossi excludes a minor. We're not only excluding someone under Mufla. We're saying that Truma is even more strict, let's say. You have to be complete 13. You have to be a complete bar mitzvah. Okay. That's right. Okay. Now, what's the source number 1? Rabbi Yudah b'shem Rab Hila. When it says, we're going to take a look in Parshas Koirach, just to read the whole pasuk in Torah Oin HaShalom. You can look all the way in the bottom, where again the Torah is speaking about the Levi. The Levi separating from the Levi's Meiser, Trumas Meiser, and we already established that all of the rules that is given to the Levi when he separates Meiser, Minha Meiser, the same is for all of us when we separate Truma Gedoyla. And look at the words of the Chumash, that v'loisisu olav chet, that the Levi will not bear a sin, baharimcham eschel boy mimenu, when he separates the best from it. What does that mean? This is Pashat Pshat in the Pasuk. The Levi gets 10%. You have Meiser. Now, when you get, let's think about, you get 10 apples. So the Levi has to give 1 apple to the Kohen. We all know that. When you go into your pantry, if people still eat apples, what apple do you pick for yourself? Some people just pick the first apple comes to the hand. Many people I know, they begin to look through for the best apple, however you define it. Chelboy, literally chelboy means the chel of the fats, but chelboy in the Torah always means the best of. The best. So the Torah is advocating that when the Levi gives 10% from the Levi's Meiser to the Kohen, he should give the best. The 10% should be from the best. The cream of the crop, and the Torah words it like this, that he won't bear a sin because he's separating the best from it. That's the way God speaks. In other words, if you're going to go ahead, you Levi, and you're going to keep the best for yourself, you're going to give 10% in quantity, but the quality won't be the best. If you're going to give him the worst, that won't be viewed favorably. It's going to be like a sin. Now, who is someone who's in the category of bearing a sin or not bearing a sin? A gadol. A katan is not shaykh in sins, right? He's not yet responsible. Let's read it inside. Since the Torah uses the words, v'lo yisisu alav chet, Gavaldik, right? So, as shehu b'nesiyas avain, someone who is subject to bearing sin, such a person has the power halachically to be able to toiring, to separate truma. But the eshe einoi b'nesiyas avain, which is a minor, right? Even if he's a mufla samach le'ish, a mufla samach le'ish is not chayiv in punishment. There's no punishment until bar mitzvah or bas mitzvah. So such a person is einoi toirem. Okay, now that l'chayda is a great raya to Rabbi Meir. So when the hativain in the Yerushalmi means I have a question. It's like meisvei. But the Marafulda writes over here, right before the end of the narrow lines, is that, don't forget, when you justified Rav Meir, you are really bringing a kasha to the other chachamim. The other chachamim is both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yehuda is even more lenient. Rabbi Yehuda holds even if you're not mufla, truma is unique. But even according to Rabbi Yossi, a mufla. The Torah says v'leisisu alav chet. So hativain. So they counter. They challenge Rav Meir. Your proof is not a proof. Problem is their counter is great. If you're making this link, something won't fit. You know what doesn't fit? Harei goy or akum, whatever it used to be goy. However, they changed it. Now we're back. Make it clear. Goyim are responsible to keep their Sheva mitzvahs b'nei noyach, which, as we had in Chulin, it's 70, it's 7, it's 30, it was 100, whatever it is. But a goy is not obligated to separate truma, even though we already spoke in this Masechta and in the prior Masechtas that really there is a machlokes tanoim whether product that grows in land that belongs to a goy and that product reached the oinas hamaisres, it was smoothed, whether that product has to be tithed, the product. And we're going according to the opinions that hold the product has to be tithed, but the owner doesn't have to tithe it. A goy is not mechuyev to separate maisres. Nevertheless, the halacha is that if the goy chooses to tithe it, we just had this a few daf ago, but for commercial reasons, he wants to have a Jewish customers. A goy is able to tithe it. A goy doesn't bear any sin if he doesn't. It's perfect. In other words, nevertheless, you see that there is no link between being able to separate truma and bearing the sin for not doing so. Okay. Now, could we have explained? Yes, we could have. There's not enough time. This is what the Chachamim challenged Rav Meir with. And therefore, let's go to the next. That even someone who doesn't bear sin is able to separate. So let a minor also be able to separate. So now again, I know some people began with Rav Abba, but now we're having this as the second. Rav Abba bar Kahana b'shem Rabbanan. Not the Rabbanan that argue with Rav Meir. This is all giving another source, L'shitas Rabbi Meir. And what is that? That when it says, V'nechshav lochem trumaschem, again, these are words that we find by whom? In Parshas Koirach, that Hashem will consider the Levi separating the Maiserim and HaMaiser, as if they separated Truma itself. And we already had this before, right? No, this is a compliment to the Levi. The Levi doesn't own land. Nevertheless, when he separates Maiser and HaMaiser, it's like he separates, he's doing the same mitzvah. But the word V'nechshav also, al pidrush, comes from the word machshava. In other words, that to designate Truma, you have to have intent to designate Truma. You have to have kavana. You have to have machshava. Okay, but let's go back to the minor. So, as shekosavay machshava, someone upon whom or about whom that the term machshava is applicable, who, meaning someone who can have machshava, who can have machshava, an adult, that person is toidim. But the es she'ein kosuv by machshava, therefore, eino toidim. Now, just to make it clear, I don't want to review what we learned in the beginning of the Masechta, which was just a few daf ago. A minor could have maisa and a chanami, but not pure machshava. And since, like we will see later, like we already spoke out, that really, all what's needed for truma is machshava. Machshava is not something that a minor is able to have, just machshava. And by the way, for the record, this will also explain how perhaps truma is different than a neder, because a neder is ishkiyafli. You have to articulate. A neder b'machshava is gurnished. Truma b'machshava is not nothing. Let's come back over here.
1 second, but
Yes.
but based on that, truma would be more lenient, so to speak.
In other words, that's Rav Meir. That's why Rav Meir holds that if even a muflu separated truma, ain't truma say truma, even b'di'evet. even a mufla.
And just to be clear, according to what we're saying right now, is this also a question on the one that holds it's a year before? Meaning a year before, is that capable of
That no,
machshava or no?
No. In other words, it's very good, Danny. In other words, the Chachamim who argue with Rav Meir would have a problem with this source. What do they do with that? Like we mentioned, Rabbi Yehuda goes even more than Rabbi Yossi, but both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi hold that a mufla is able to separate truma. Why? The Torah says the words v'nechshav. So therefore, hativain, they challenge the source. Harei goy, again, she'ein ksiv boy machshava. We don't find that a goy is able to affect anything purely with his thought. His thoughts don't have any legal impact. And again, nevertheless, if he physically separates truma from his own produce by separating it, he has maisa, then it works. And how do we know that a goy doesn't have machshava? That's something that it says explicitly. We learned the Braisa from Rabbi Hoshaya that goyim ein lahem machshava. Very good. As understood right now, a goy cannot affect any legal process through thought alone. So a gavaldik. So here again, the fact that the Torah writes v'nechshav, you'll have to explain it. By the way, the pshat of the nechshav is not machshava. The pshat of the nechshav is, like we just mentioned, Hashem is telling the Levi, don't feel you're losing out. You're not losing out. Why would the Levi lose out? The Levi doesn't have land, even though the Levium had a lot of land. But the Levium were not given land as a Yerusha by Chalukas Haaretz. So from the beginning, the Levium could have said, we're missing out on the mitzvah. God says, no, you won't. That when you get Ma'aser Rishon and you give 10% for Ma'aser, it's mamish like the same thing. V'nechshav, it's reckoned for you. Nevertheless, there's a drasha of a nechshav, but the drasha of the nechshav cannot be so powerful to exclude the cotton because we see it doesn't exclude the goy. And again, Rabbi Shaya has a brisa with the words goyim ein lahem machshava. That will be explained. Whoa, 1 second. So the Gemara says, no, you misunderstood Rabbi Shaya. Let's read what the Gemara says. Come on, daf chesamid beis over there, Rabbi Shaya. He's speaking about machshava that is able to make foods muksher lekabel tumah. So quickly going back in Parsha Shmini, when the Torah says explicitly that all foods, after they are harvested, after they are disconnected from the ground, for them to become tamei, it's not enough for a source of tumah to have halachic contact with it. Of course, without any contact with tumah, it will not by itself become tamei. But there has to be a step prior, and that is that the food has to become susceptible to becoming tamei. Muksher lekabel tumah. How does that happen? 2 things. Number one, any one of the 7 liquids has to have contact with the food, and it's not just physical contact with the food, but the owner of the food has to be satisfied by the fact that there was such a contact. So it's not that the owner has to put it into water or put water on it. No, even if it happened by itself, there are many other details. We just learned also in this Masechta, the water has to be talush. These details are not important. There's something called foods have to first become muksher likabel tumah. And part of that would mean is that even if waters, any one of the 7 liquids, yad, shachat, dam, is the Rashi Tevis, the mnemonic that Yidden used to remember all of the 7 liquids. So if it touched food, then it's muksher. Yeah? Is it automatically muksher? No. The owner has to have satisfaction. That's the machshava that Rabbi Yeshaya was referring to, that if the goy didn't do on maisa of being machshir as food, if it happened by itself, but he's happy that the foods got wetted, that contentment is not enough for the foods to become tamei. So in that context, does his machshava not have any impact? But over here we're speaking about truma. So again, since we see a goy is able to separate truma, you cannot refute Rav Meir. You cannot refute Rav Meir, whose sources machshava v'nechshav. You can't refute it from a goy. Why not? because the goy could have machshava by truma. What the goy cannot have is machshava to be is lahachsher. We're separating dinim hachshara from the capacity of separating truma. Why would we differentiate? So as we quoted already in our words of introduction, and this is based on a Tosfos that we have in Masechtas Nida, that again, if one were to view tevel not as something called tevel, category aleph, and then when you separate truma, now you have two new things, truma and chulin. That's not the way Tosfos looks at it. Even though when truma gets mixed with chulin, it's called dimua, but tevel is like dimua. It's not mamish the same, but it's similar, which is that from the outset, we already view all produce as something that has a mixture of truma and meiser and chulin, and what's needed is not for you to affect anything new. What's needed is for you to simply separate that which is already there. Affecting something brand new is something harder. That's why Rabbi Yishaya says, for example, that a guy doesn't have machshava, legal. The Torah never gave him that koyach through his machshava to change something, to take something that's not muksher, to make it muksher. But when it comes to the separating of truma, you're not really doing anything new. The truma is already here. All you are doing is you're revealing what part of it is truma, what part is chulin. Okay. Gewaldig. So therefore, a goy has that ability. And coming back over here, according to our Gemara, that a mayor excludes a minor, even if he's a mufla, from separating, because a minor doesn't have machshava. A neder. First of all, many understand bishitas Rav Meir, that Rav Meir holds that mida oiraisa, a mufla can also not make a neder. I don't want to get into that topic. But let me go back to this, that by a neder, you need articulation. If I have in mind, there has to be piv by shavin, but there has to be piv. By truma, machshava is the key component. And a minor, even a mufla, doesn't have machshava. Okay. Now that we have this machlokes between, let's go to Rabbi Yosef. I'm not going to quote Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda has this chiddush that a minor, even under mufla, can separate truma. B'diavad. So let's just focus on Rabbi Yossi and Rav Meir. That's clear. Rav Meir says truma got to be an adult. Rabbi Yossi says no, truma you got to be a mufla. Let's see how this is going to be applied when it comes to the following. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Acha quoted Rabbi Chinana in the name of Rav Kahana. Now we're going to have Rav Kahana and we're going to have Rabbi Yechanan. So remember, Kedivrei mishu oimer einoi toirem, according to the opinion that says that even a mufla cannot separate truma, which is like we just learned Shitas Rabbi Meir. Accordingly, einoi magdish. Wow. He cannot consecrate an animal as a korban. Now something becomes very clear over here. Just to make it clear that being magdish an animal is mamish like a neder. So what Rav Kahana understands is that now that we see from the Braisa, which is really Tanakama here, in our Mishnah, it's clear, we just don't know who the author is, that Rav Meir holds that a mufla cannot separate truma. Rav Meir holds that a minor cannot, there's no such a thing as a mufla. Categorically, he cannot make a neder. And he cannot be magdish. It's very important. We do find in Chazal that a mufla samuch leish is able to make a neder. Yeah, Rav Meir holds that that's something only midrabanan, and they only made it v'negei nedarim. That's the way Rav Kahana understands. That's a new thing over here. Not everyone agrees with Rav Kahana's understanding, but he's equating truma, karbanos, and nedarim. I'm just adding the nedarim because being magdish something is a form of a neder, mamish, as we learned in Masechtas Nedarim. And by the way, truma is also like a neder. And just for the record, that if someone were to want, just like one can be matir a neder, you can be matir truma, mamish. But let's come back over here. So that's Rav Kahana's opinion. In other words, Rav Kahana is basically telling you that Rab Meir holds that mida oiraisa, a minor, a mufla, cannot make a neder. The whole thing of a neder, that a mufla, yeah, that's only midrabanan. And the Rabbanan make no such a thing by Truma. Now, says the Gemara, V'lama loy amar kedivrei mi shuhu oimer toirem magdish. Why didn't he also speak out the opposite side? Why did he only speak out to Rav Meir? Why didn't he continue to say that according to the one that says toirem, who says toirem in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yosi, according to Rabbi Yosi, a minor, a mufla, is able to affect a carbon. He can take an animal and say that this animal is an oila, and that will be effective. You know why he didn't say it? Because since you also have the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, the Rabbi Yehuda oimer toirem, Rabbi Yehuda holds that someone who's even under mufla, an 11-year-old, a 10-year-old, our kids, maybe even Mordechai here, you don't understand. A kid can be 5 years old. They can understand what it is. 6 years old, whatever the age is. Rabbi Yehuda ve'eina magdish. In other words, everyone agrees that even Rabbi Yehuda will agree that under the age of mufla, you can't be magdish. By the way, it is on this statement, even b'di'evet. It's on this statement that the Tosfos writes what we spoke on this. And why would that be? Because, again, Tosfos holds that Tevel is already a mixture. It's a mixture of Truma and Chulin, and therefore you're not really affecting anything new. You're not being magdish the Truma. Masha'enkin, if you're going to go ahead and you're going to take an animal that's really Chulin, and you're going to declare that this animal is a carbon oila, you're elevating the Kedusha. When you're that young, if you're under Mufla, for sure, you have no such koyach. Anyways, coming over here. So he just didn't want to speak out the other side. But you're right. You're right that what? That Rabbi Yosi that holds that a minor mufla is able to separate truma will hold that a mufla is able to make a carbon. A mufla is able to make a neder. Midoy raisa. Gavaldik. So holds Rav Kahana. However, Rabbi Yechanan argues with Rav Kahana. Says Rabbi Yechanan Amar that afilu l'man the Amar eino toidam. Even Rav Meir that we're learning over here, who holds that if you're 12, you cannot separate truma. That's a din in truma. But he will agree that a mufla, not like Rabbi Yehuda, but yes, like Rabbi Yosi, that a mufla samach leish is able mida oiraisa to consecrate an animal, which also means he's really saying that according to Rabbi Meir, a mufla hasamach leish mida oiraisa can make a neder. And now we have to use an opposite logic of the Tosfos. That we said this in the intro, but to repeat it, which is gavaldik. What will be the logic in this direction? What will be the logic? Why is it that if you are 12, you can make a carbon? You know what it means to make a carbon? There's no greater kedusha than a carbon. You're elevating the animal. Chulin, it becomes kachem isbeach. And why is it that you can't? And why is it that Rav Meir will hold you can't separate truma? So, like we explained, it's going the opposite direction. When you declare an animal a carbon, what did you do, Aviv? You took something that's chulin and you made it holy. Even by a neder, I'm not going to use the word kedusha, but let's use the word isur. This is permitted on me. Nachanes, thank you, Hashem, coffee. And if a person, not me, if someone theoretically were to say that coffee is usur upon me like a carbon, then they added an isur. So to go from mutter to asur, the Torah, according to Rabbi Yechanan, midoy raisa, if you are already 12, you can do that. When you are separating truma, you're doing two things. Whether you hold like Tosfos, that it's already a mixture. By the way, Rashi argues with Tosfos. It's a machlikas rishonim. And he holds that tevel is a category for itself. But one thing is for sure, that the truma part of the separation, there is kedusha in it. That a minor is able to give kedusha. But the problem is that when you're elevating the truma, you're doing something else. What else are you doing? The remaining now went from tevel to mesukan. It's fixed. It's rectified. Really, it's not fully rectified because you have to separate the other tithes. It doesn't matter. It's mesukan from truma. So you're being mater something. You're making something permitted. That is a bigger koyach. That's the difference. L'shitas Rabbi Yechanan, that even though Rav Meir holds that eino toirem, yes, magdish, because Truman has a part of it where you're downgrading a prohibition. You're releasing something. To release, you have no koyach. And releasing is a much bigger koyach.
How about, can a 12-year-old get married?
Can a 12-year-old get married? Kevin is asking a bomb question. Well, if you're being magdish something, nach the words are kedushin.
It requires machshava. It also requires like an oath, or
A 12-year-old boy, it would not be kedushin. He's a katan.
Yeah, but he's asking why not. So let me use my logic. Let's use the same words over here. That when you're doing kedushin, there's two steps to kedushin, which is that she is not allowed to be with anyone else. Neither may you. But let's speak about to her. But then you're being mated them to be with each other. Even though kedushin doesn't make the heter, but it's going in that direction. Maybe that's something that a minor cannot do.
Yeah.
But one thing is for sure, no, he cannot. Even though, just not to confuse, biyasoi biya, it's a whole different din. Even even if he's 9 years old, but that's a din in biya, not a din in kedushin. Okay. What was that? I can't hear. No, there are katanas that get married. That's a whole different thing. That's because the man gave kedushin to the father. To woman can be the woman could be. Anyways, I'm leaving it open. That's just theoretically. It's a great comparison. Okay, so let's go. Says the Gemara. Now that we established that a mufla samachlish could be magdish. Now, by the way, who holds that? Just to make it clear. According to Rabbi Yehuda, everyone. According to Rabbi Yosi, everyone. According to Rav Meir, Machlokes, Rav Kahana, Rabbi Yochanan. But be that as it may, according to all of the opinions that hold that a mufla samuch leish is old enough to be able to be magdish or carbon, let's go into details. Umahu magdish, exactly what carbon is he able to consecrate? So let's go. A carbon oila is brought from the kindness of your heart. It's called a voluntary offering, right? A carbon nedava, neder or nedava. But you're not mechuyev. A carbon shlamim is a voluntary offering that he could do. What about a carbon chatas? For what does one bring a chatas? For violating a sin for which, if one would have done it on purpose, they would have been chayiv kares, minimal kares, sometimes kares and skila, but kares. So if you do that, b'shoigeg, you're chayiv to bring a carbon chatas. The classic example that Chazal give, even though today it's not relevant, beruchnius it is, but the concept is that people then didn't buy meat in the grocery. You bought an animal, you took it to the shaychet, and the shaychet shechted it, and one of the things your owner needed to learn how to do, aside of taking out the blood, is taking out the fats, and it's trickier with the fats. With the bloods, it's relatively easy. If you know how to rinse it, and then you salt it, and then you rinse it, you know how to do with that. But when it comes to the fats, it happened that some fatty parts of the animal are called shumen, are allowed to be eaten. Some parts of the fats are called chelev. Chelev is the worst prohibition. It's more severe than eating a chazer. So the example that Chazal give is chatas chelev. People ate, it was b'shoigeg. By accident, they ate a part of the fats that was not allowed to be eaten. So the Gemara says, Lahavi chatas chelev eni yochel. Even though he's able to be magdish, a carton is not a bar chiyuva. She'ein loy chatas chelev. Similarly, chatas dam, Ein a yochel, she'ein loy chatas dam, and these are two examples, chelev adam. But really, the Gemara is saying something very important. He's able to consecrate, but he's never going to. Now, if I am not chayiv to bring a chatas, I'm not chayiv to bring a chatas, and I say on an animal that you are my chatas, my words are nonsensical. Even if, God forbid, I'm going to sin tomorrow. Even if I'm going to sin tomorrow, I'm not chayiv yet. My father told me that a Zayda once hit him, Kimin Hagai. And he asked him, what did I do? He says, for what you will do. But by karbanis, it doesn't work that way. So now, Mao, Shiyavi Karban Ziva, here's Gavaldik. If, let's go a Zav by a boy, that's going back Kavan, and Ziva by a minor. So if there's a certain type of, let's call this an unnatural and unusual seminal emission that comes out of a man. So if it's the normal seminal emission, he's called a balkedi, he has to go to the mikveh, and he's good. But if it happened twice or 3 times, but vis-a-vis Yaradinim, then the whole status changes, and now this person, if it happened 3 times, not only do you have to go, you have to have 7 clean days, and you have to go into a well water, mayim chayim, not well water, spring water, but you have to bring karbanos. The person is a mitzayra. One of the many steps of removing the tumas of tzaras is that bringing karbanos. Now, it's interesting. A minor could become tamei as a zav. Will become tamei. A minor can become tamei with tzaras. So now the question is, ma'achar shehu choiva. On one hand, there is an obligation to bring, but we're saying a minor is not a bar chiyuva. So would that mean that he's eina maybe? Gavaldik question, or do we say, forget about the chiyuv part. He's not mechoy, but he's tamei. And you know how cruel it would be for a minor not to be able to go into the Beis Hamikdash? Think about it. Because if he cannot consecrate, consecrating for him it doesn't work. He has to be able to be consecrated. He does become tamei, then yes, maybe. So the Gemara for that says, Gavaldik, pshita loch shu maybe. I love it. Pshita loch. And what's the pshita? The Rashi Ilya writes 4 lines in the top in the left column, because it says regarding the Torah, derachel darkim noyam. And how is it pleasant to have a status that someone is tamei and they cannot get out of their tumah until they become bar mitzvah? There's nothing pleasant. There's nothing more unpleasant than a yid not being able to go to the Beis Hamikdash, having a status of tumah. So it's a given that he's able to be magdish, that korban, not mitzad the chiyuv, but mitzad the steps necessary to remove tumah. And he wants to remove tumah. From here you see that minor should go to the mikveh. Same idea. When it comes to tumah, we don't look at you're chayiv or not chayiv.
Would the minor's father be able to bring the korban on his behalf if he was tamei? Like, if you were going to say that he can't bring it himself?
So that's what I was thinking. That in other words, am I able to consecrate a korban chiyuv for you if you're not chayiv to separate? If you are unable to separate it? Let me tell you guys. If there's a din of zchiyah and there's a din of shlichus, ain't shlichus lekatan. If it's an act of schus, then maybe yeah. If we look at zchiyah,
how else do you get a katan out of tumah ever? You have a 5-year-old that's tamei, and if you're a kohen, you want to feed your kid a truma or kachim kalam.
Not every tumah demands a korban, but those who demand korbanos, the father will bring it on his behalf. Okay, let me say it different. Danny, you're right. A father can bring it on the behalf of the minor. But still, it's a pshita that the minor should be able, if he chooses, to bring it on his own. You're making a good point, because our conversation is only by a mufla. We're not saying that prior to mufla. And the logic of the Rechel Darkinoyim, so yeah, the father can bring it on his behalf, but also, now that he's 12, he should be able to bring it on his own. However, the next question is, Mao sheyasa b'hem shliach. And I want to make it clear that the question of shlichus is a 2-way question. Okay. Normally the rule is a minor cannot appoint a shliach, and a minor cannot become someone else's shliach. Let's go to our topic. Here you have a minor that became a zav, and now came the time at the end of the 7 clean days to bring the korbanos. Could he appoint someone to bring it on him, mitzat shlichus, or could he be appointed to consecrate it on behalf of someone else? No, do we say that a minor is excluded from the Torah of shlichus because he's not mechuyev in anything? But now that we established that this is something that he is able to do himself, if he's able to do it himself, maybe he should be able to represent someone else. Or you have this general rules, and we just had this again. Everything is already in Trumos. Gam atem, not the atem, gam atem. So we're makish the atem to the gam. So even though the words of Chazal is ma atem b'nei bris, af shluchachem b'nei bris, but there's a similar ma atem are adults, b'nei chiyuva. Gam is also shluchachem, has to be someone who's mechuyev. And by the way, that's what bris means. The bris is you're mechuyev in the covenant. So maybe ein nasa shlichus. So the question. So Hasiv Rabbi Yudan, we have another minute. Harei yesh lo tevel debar toiron. According to both Rabbi Yossi and here even Rabbi Yehuda, right, a minor is able to separate trumos from his tevel. Can a minor separate tevel for someone else? I mean, if you would subscribe to the concept of shlichus, he's able to separate truma. Are you going to say einoi pointed tivloi devar toira? According to even biblical law, he is not able to separate truma for someone else. That's the gamatim. So just like clearly you see when it comes to the dinim of truma, we exclude a minor from shlichus because the whole source of shlichus is gamatim, ma'atem bar chiyuva. Can also af al pishu matama bohen. And not only that, not only does he become tamei, the ibvart is that he's able to be magdish even those karbanis that are in the category of chiyuv. Nevertheless, again, it's a given that einoi nasa shliach. Shliach is something he's excluded from shlichus. And we're going to stop over here because it's 7 o'clock. I hope I got the okay. And we're going to continue tomorrow.
Thank you.